What an incredibly strange few weeks it's been. Only 2 Sundays ago, we would have been lining up with the crowds, waving our palm branches and welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem. Instead, we were a week or so into a lockdown, having given up much more during Lent than any of us ever thought we would have just a short while ago. And so we walked with Jesus through Holy Week this year, from the solitude of our own homes, unable to be together in our usual way, and we watched as he was betrayed and led away. We sat with Jesus in the loneliness of the garden, and maybe this year we were able to get a deeper understanding of what that sense of isolation really meant. And later, at the foot of the cross, we sat with him as it seemed the darkness was closing in. And then everything changed. Immediately before our gospel reading this morning, we read of the tomb being empty, the stone is rolled away, and the linen that Jesus' body was wrapped in is just lying there. And you can almost hear the distress and confusion going over in the minds of the disciples as they make this strange discovery. Was it all some kind of elaborate hoax, or had the body been taken away by grave robbers to further some other agenda? Because the disciples had seen him die, of that they were certain, but it might well have been at that point the only thing they were certain of. They had no idea at all what the future held. They didn't really understand what any of it meant, because all they knew for certain at that stage was that their friend and teacher had been killed by the authorities, and now his body was nowhere to be seen. The disciples, in their confusion and full of desolation, return to their homes, and we get the account of Jesus making his resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene. And it's that meeting of Jesus with Mary Magdalene which brings us onto our reading this morning, because she, of course, had immediately gone to tell the disciples that she had in fact seen and spoken to Jesus. We're not told whether or not the disciples believed what Mary was telling them. Who could believe them for being skeptical about her claims to have seen and spoken to Jesus a few days after he was killed? The disciples were under their own lockdown, huddled together, unsure of what the future might hold, and afraid of any repercussions now that Jesus was dead. And yet, it was there that Jesus appeared to them, in that locked room, showing them the marks that proved that he was indeed their resurrected Lord. They were all there. All the disciples were there with one notable exception, and that was Thomas, who was not present with his friends on that occasion. The disciples weren't too sure about what Mary had said, and now Thomas was questioning what they too were saying. He'd had a whole week to think things over, but still he wasn't buying it. It was all too fantastic. Too far-fetched. It just can't be. This isn't how things happen. Maybe it's fake news. Maybe it's some story concocted by Mary in the madness of grief. Unless, says Thomas, unless I see with my own eyes the mark of the nails in his hands, and I put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, then I will not believe. Thomas wants and he demands proof, because hearing secondhand from other people, no matter who they are, simply isn't good enough for him. Unless I see, I will not believe. I think Thomas actually gets something of a bad rap in general, to be honest. For centuries, people who don't take what they've been told at face value have been called a doubting Thomas. The implication being that doubt or skepticism isn't an especially admirable trait to possess. It's not the worst thing in the world, I guess, but it does tend to be seen as something that's a bit negative. Poor old Thomas. Why couldn't he be known instead as believing Thomas or faithful Thomas? But no. For all these years, he's been stuck with the label doubting Thomas, as though this one single moment of questioning what he's been told now has to define his entire life. And we live today in a society which places great value on evidence and proof. on whether something can be verified and objectively shown to be real or not. We question what we're told, what we read, sometimes even what we see. In a time when we are bombarded with constant news and facts, then we Google alternative news and alternative facts, and we're still not always sure what side to take, what to believe, who to believe. So when we read that Thomas refuses to believe in the resurrection based on mere hearsay, when we hear of his demand for physical proof, perhaps we are of two minds. Our pious, church-going, religious selves are tempted to point our fingers at Thomas. Shame on you, Thomas, we say. Shame on you. And you call yourself an apostle, and yet you don't believe? But there's another part of us which cheers him on for saying probably what most of us would want to say ourselves. Because if it's true, and we're not saying it's not true, but if it is true, then why can't we have the proof? Because we too want to see. We too want to touch. And this whole doubting Thomas thing isn't quite accurate, because the actual Greek word that's used is apistos. And apistos translates more accurately to unbelief rather than doubt. It seems that Thomas, no matter that he spent the last 3 years with Jesus, learning from him, he'd seen miracles at first hand. Despite all of that, it seems that Thomas has now lost whatever belief he once had. And who could blame him? He was having a very real crisis of faith. Jesus was dead, and he'd seen it happen. And everything that Thomas knows tells him that it's just not possible, because dead men don't suddenly appear out of a locked room from nowhere. And yet he reaches out, hardly daring to hope. And in that moment of contact with Jesus, he comes to what must be the most mind-blowing realization of all, as he says, "My Lord and my God." Because point for point, Jesus meets Thomas's demands for physical proof. And then he goes on to say, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." And of course, once that first generation had passed on, and Thomas and his fellow disciples were no longer around themselves, of course, there would be no living witnesses to any of these events. Everybody who would come after them would believe, not because they had reached out and touched Jesus themselves, not because they'd seen the physical evidence. But Jesus is saying here that seeing him incarnate, seeing him in the flesh, is not necessarily a requirement for belief. And that applies to us. That applies to each one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. We too come with our doubts, with our uncertainties and with our questions. And we are loved and cherished by God exactly as we are. Just as Thomas was loved and cherished exactly as he was. And we might not be able to physically reach out and touch Jesus in the same way that Thomas was able, but we are loved and blessed just as much as he was. "Unless I see," says Thomas. And there might be times when we say the same thing. "Unless I see, I cannot believe." But we see in the worn out faces of those who are working in our hospitals and care homes right now, we see in those faces the face of Jesus. And in the many thousands of volunteers who collect shopping or prescriptions, or who simply lend an ear over the phone, we see in them the hands and the ears of Jesus. We might not see Jesus physically, but we see him very much in the words and actions of all those around us. I'm reminded of the wonderful and still very relevant words of St. Teresa of Avila. "Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion to the world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world." We come to Jesus through faith. We receive him through faith. And so wherever we are today, whoever we are, Jesus is standing right there alongside us, whatever our circumstances might be. And so today, May our prayer be that we join in those words of Thomas, my Lord and my God. Amen.